So my job in the next 20 minutes or so is just to try and put some of these micro studies, these case studies, these wonderful rich case studies that we're going to explore, just to maybe put them into a wider context of what we might call the public sphere in 2015. What are some of how might we define, understand, describe the relationship between religion and the public sphere in this year and in this particular time just before an election? So I'm going to try and do that with reference to just some 5 ideas I'm going to just throw to you, and hopefully that they will resonate with you as the day goes on. The first idea I want to suggest is that religion has struck a chord in the current political debate, particularly the deeper levels of political debate about, well, what sort of society do we want to create? Do we want to actually return politics back to having a politics that's not an end in itself, but creates means by which ends can be created? Is it just a blip, though? Is this interest in the religious voice just a pre-election blip, or is it something that's more permanent, that's shaping the public sphere? And I think, as Rachel alluded, often in the faith groups we tend to think that our voice isn't heard, we tend to think that religion is becoming more and more marginalised, but actually I'm not sure that that is the case. I'm then going to talk very briefly about the idea of the risk society. I think the idea of risk is something that permeates deep in our public sphere, in our social order. And the reason I'm choosing this is because there was a guy called Ulrich Beck, a sociologist some of you may have heard of, who sadly died quite unexpectedly in the new year. So I thought, well, I'll use his ideas as a kind of way into exploring what the public space is. And for those of you that are interested and have got the energy, at 6:30 this evening at the London School of Economics, which is not far from here, you could just about make it. There's a really interesting lecture in memory of Ulrich Beck, because he was associated with the London School of Economics, looking at the future of world society. So in a way, it'll be an absolute sort of perfect sort of complement to what we're trying to do, really. We're working at a micro level. They're very much working at a macro level. In fact, I've got the details just there. 6:30 to 8:30 this evening. Names you may have heard of, like Anthony Giddens, Richard Sennett, Craig Calhoun, Mary Kaldor. But what future for world society? We think we're trying to do something impossible in a day. I think they're trying to do something even more impossible in 2 hours. Then I'm going to talk about the idea of the post-secular public sphere, the new visibility of religion in the 21st century. And then talk a little bit about the importance of spiritual capital as part of that whole shift that's going on towards a deeper search for meaning and values in public life. And then very briefly just raise the issue of the idea of progressive localism. Is there such a thing as progressive localism? And is this something that faith groups are contributing to? And what does it look like at the local level? But religion has struck a chord, I'm thinking, and particularly, as Rachel's already mentioned, the Anglican Church has sort of got in first with their kind of pitch. But obviously other faith communities will also be bringing in their perspectives on what is the nature of the public space, what sort of society do we want to create. And I was very sort of taken really with a couple of comments that appeared just in the Observer on Sunday, so a couple of days ago. Will Hutton, writing from a kind of economics point of view, in his column in the Observer, talks, the bishops, about them citing St. Paul's letter to the Philippians as an inspiration that should bind believers and non-believers. Whatever is true, whatever is honourable, whatever is just, whatever is pure, whatever is pleasing, whatever is commendable, if there is any excellence, and if there is anything worthy of praise about these things. They long, they say, for a more humane society that reflects St. Paul's injunction, a better politics for a better nation. So there is a deep desire being expressed, certainly from those quarters, about can we create a more humane politics? Can we create a better politics for a better nation? And then David Mitchell, who's usually quite a sort of cynical, cultural kind of observer, in his weekly column in The Observer, again highlights the bishop's pastoral letter. And he says they're calling on us to make a leap of faith, not to a belief in eternal life, but to the liberal conviction that society is better, that collectively and individually we'll be happier if we look for and expect the best in each other, and if our instinct is compassion, not anger. So there is a lot of interest in the religious voice, in the religious perspective in the public square at the moment. Is this something that's more permanent, or is it just a blip? Ulrich Beck talked in the 1980s about the risk society, and I think he was putting his finger on something quite perceptive even then. He wrote a book in 1986 called Risk Society, Towards a New Modernity. And what he meant by a new modernity was that the old modernity, if you like, which produced the Industrial Revolution and came from the Enlightenment in the 18th and 19th centuries, and was built upon this idea that you could measure cause and effect, that you could predict things, that you could build things, that you could always advance society through careful planning and the application of rational and technological solutions. Something happened in the 1980s that threw all that into confusion. And he was, I think, anticipating in many ways the growth of the World Wide Web, but he was also talking about the growing interconnection between economies in the global marketplace. And what he was saying was that when you interconnect things so randomly and so closely, you build into society what he called unintended consequences. You are no longer in control of the relationship between cause and effect. And of course, I think since the 1980s, we've seen with the ever-growing interconnection of global economies and through the internet and the World Wide Web, that, as he said, unintended consequences can very easily go viral. They can very easily exponentially increase. So he's saying we've now created a society for ourselves where there are more unintended consequences than intended consequences. And he talked about this idea of a reflexive public space, by which he meant that we weren't particularly good at reflecting, but what he meant was that everything we think we want to do and we intend to do will be very easily blown off course by these unintended consequences. There's a very kind of close feedback loop between all these things. And therefore, he said, we now live in a risk society because of the multiplication of all these unintended consequences that are going viral, and we are no longer in control, if you like, of the destiny and the outcomes of our society. These pose a huge risk to us as a society, as a global order. So he wasn't being particularly optimistic, you might say. And way back in the 1980s, he was already recognising climate change as this kind of agglomeration of unintended consequences that have now got so big and so huge that it's actually very difficult to know how to unpack and unpick and untangle them and create a sense of purpose and drive within society. And it seems to me that on a micro level, a lot of people, if you ask a lot of people today, well, how are you feeling about life? What's your outlook? I think a lot of people would, at that micro level, kind of register that sense of risk. Well, I don't really know who's looking out for me anymore. Who am I accountable to? Who's accountable to me? Have I got to kind of somehow forge my own destiny in competition with lots of other people? So I think part of the public sphere that we're speaking into, part of the public order that we're speaking into today, is this one where people feel, well, what is the direction in which we're going? Are we in control? Do we have a sense in which we can change the established order and the existing order of things? Who looks out for us? Where are we heading? And I think that's a huge challenge to us all, not just to, obviously, faith communities, but to the whole of society. So his latest book, which will now be published posthumously, you could say he's been quite honest as a sociologist. I was at a loss for an answer to the simple but necessary question: what is the meaning of the global events unfolding before our eyes? So I think the public space, the public sphere in which we're operating, is one of a lot of unknown questions and answers that seek being explicated to those questions. And that kind of brings me to this idea of raising the question: are we now living in a post-secular public space, both intellectually but also empirically? So what do I mean by that? Well, if we look at the empirical, well, let's just look briefly historically. When Ulrich Beck wrote his book on risk and new modernity in the mid-1980s, that's sort of the time, historically, when religion becomes newly emergent on the global sphere. So you have the revolution, the Iranian Revolution 1979, you have the growth of solidarity and the overthrow of communism in Poland, which kind of, led to the sort of rapid unravelling of the Soviet Union. So really, since 1989, there's been a huge vacuum in Europe of ideas about, the future of society, and religion has very much sort of, in many ways and in many different ways, filled that vacuum. But of course, globally, if you look at something like the Pew Templeton project that assiduously tries to collect data from all over the world about censuses, about surveys, on the basis of about 2,500 of these surveys, they predicted that about 84% of the world's population globally allied themselves to a religious identity. That's not necessarily saying they're religious, perhaps, but they do definitely identify themselves with a religious identity. So that kind of is quite a big predictor of how you're going to behave. So some sociologists have been thinking, okay, we need to rethink this idea that we live in a secular world. That the predictions that were made in the 19th and 20th century, that religion would sort of slowly wither on the vine and just become a kind of private activity, need to be looked at again. And the person who's really taken those ideas forward is a German social thinker and philosopher called Jürgen Habermas. Some of you may have heard of him. Who actually was trained at the Marxist School of Social Theory at Frankfurt. And he's the first person who really kind of asked this very troublesome question, I think, for lots of people in the West. Do we now need to see ourselves as having moved from a secular society to a post-secular one? And he said there's not only the empirical reality out there, but there's also a moral reality. And he was saying very clearly that from his perspective, the global order that we had created, a bit like what Ulrich Beck was saying, was that the form of capitalism that we've allowed to develop, the neoliberal form of capitalism, has kind of eroded a lot of our common values. It's in danger of eroding our democracy, ideas of liberal democracy, which came from the Enlightenment, because we no longer see ourselves as part of a collective. We see ourselves as individual monads or nomads, wandering through. So he came up with this interesting definition of the post-secular, which is deliberately open-ended, I think. He says we need to adopt a post-secular self-understanding of society as a whole, in which the vigorous continuation of religion in a continually secularizing environment must be reckoned with. So again, raising the question from Ulrich Beck, from Jürgen Habermas, what sort of public sphere are we living in? And I think there's more questions than answers about that. So I think into that kind of space, religion is no surprise in the sense that religious ideas and indeed religious practices are being seen again in a new light. There's a general interest out there. It's not just people of faith who are saying that religion's important. It's actually lots of different other people who are saying that religion's important. And we've almost, as those two quotes that I mentioned at the beginning of this session, it's like society as a whole is reawakening themselves to the importance of religious ideas and values as a way of shaping the sort of society we want. And I've only got 5 minutes, so I shall try and move on very quickly. So this is where kind of, for me, I want to introduce the idea of spiritual capital. Because spiritual capital, as we have worked with it with within the William Temple Foundation is a very, very important part of how we build sustainable politics, about how we build sustainable communities. When we did some research into urban regeneration by churches in the early 2000s, we recognised, as a lot of people did, that they did phenomenal work in terms of what they produced, and we're going to hear about it again today. The sort of services that are provided by faith groups often well exceed the kind of capacity that they have. These are quite fragile organisations who nevertheless appear to deliver goods and services well beyond their means. So we wanted to say, well, the important thing to think about that when you're thinking about faith groups and their contribution to social capital is that what drives that commitment is what I call spiritual capital. So spiritual capital is the worldview that people of faith have. It's their theological worldview, it's their values, it's their ethics. And faith groups are particularly effective, and there's not time to go into this now, but a lot of research has been done into why faith groups are so effective about putting into practice their ethics and their values. And it's not necessarily to do with the belief, but it's to do with the way that faith groups are structured, with the sense of community that they generate, that somehow makes everybody accountable to everybody else and kind of creates this booster effect of people then going out as individuals and putting into practice their spiritual capital. So spiritual capital, I'm saying, from this quote, sorry, I should have moved the thing on, energises the practical contribution that faith groups make, which I call religious capital. Spiritual capital energises religious capital by providing a theological identity and worshipping tradition, but also a value system, moral vision, and a basis of faith. So it's the why that lies behind the what. And the reason why the why is important is because, as I've been saying earlier, people now want to question deeper as to what sort of society, what sort of political culture do we want to create. We're becoming increasingly dissatisfied with just material solutions to problems. We want to delve deeper. We want to ask, why are these things important? And what is it that I can bring to the table? So, spiritual capital is something that clearly is evident within faith groups. But of course, it's not just faith groups or people who define themselves as religious who have spiritual capital. If we say that spiritual capital is the motivating value system that you have within you, your ethical worldview, your vision for transformation and change, and actually most people, if not all people, have some form of spiritual capital. They may derive it from humanism, they may derive it from socialism, they may derive it from feminism, any other worldview or ideology. And it seems to me that if we're going to try and create a move with the flow of this need for a deeper questioning of the where society is going, we've got to engage somehow the spiritual capital of everybody. Not just faith groups, 2 minutes, thank you, but everybody. And it seems to me that what's going to emerge today, and what I've been picking up from, is the role of faith groups actually in becoming hubs and sort of almost receptacles and booster transmitters for this spiritual capital that's out there. Because faith groups are becoming increasingly spaces where people feel comfortable about contributing something to something. The walls, the barriers that maybe existed 10, 15 years ago, well, this is the thesis I'm raising, maybe aren't so rigid and so sharp. And people from all faiths and none feel quite comfortable about aligning themselves with a food bank or any other type of project that we're going to hear about. It seems to me that we've moved from a kind of institutional view of what the welfare is into kind of something that's a bit more spatial, these new spaces that are cropping up. But it seems to me that faith groups are particularly good at creating those spaces and nurturing them and making sure that they don't just disappear. So I talk about leveraging the ethical and political power of spiritual capital, ? Can we do that? So just moving very quickly on to my final point. Talking about the role of faith groups, ? As being good places where we can leverage and bring into play the spiritual capital of all people. In secular terms, this has been written up, not, I don't think, in relation to my work, but just coincidentally. There's this idea out there of progressive localism. Now, I think we all know what localism is within the kind of political framework. It's the decentralisation of state services to the local community in terms of budgeting, in terms of assets. And the recent Bishop's report said, well, actually the big society, which is this kind of expression of localism, is probably a good thing if we can make it work. But the progressive element, I think, is important because this is about, as they say, as coming from critical human geography, it's a kind of attitude of mind. It's an openness of spirit. Are you open to sharing your spiritual capital with other people? Are you open to working with others to create a more coherent, a more values-based civil society? So they talk about progressive localism as outward-looking and creating positive affinities between places and social groups, negotiating global processes. These affinities, groups and networks are expansive in their geographical reach and productive new relations between places and social groups. Now, I think there's probably not time to take that in, but I think that's quite a good description, if you can go away and read it later, what we're going to hear about later on today. That's precisely what we're going to hear about, I think. Affinities of groups. It's an interesting word, affinities. It's quite loose. It's not institutional partnership. It's something that's much more organic and loose. And I'm going to leave it there just with some questions. So what does progressive localism look like on the ground? And I think today, if progressive localism is a term that is of use, and it may not be, but if it is, then what we're going to hear about is what that looks like on the ground. These affinities of different groups coming together from using different forms of spiritual capital but working for the common good. So new spaces, new opportunities and new practices. Is this calling for new forms of leadership? A question I've got, which I think emerges from what I've been reading recently, is that the political credibility of faith groups, which other people are now waking up to, emerges from authenticity, something that's quite in short demand at the moment, and emerges from the direct engagement with issues. And can spiritual revival lead to both religious and political revival? Well, that's a bit silly, isn't it, to say that? I mean, I'm not sure we're talking about spiritual revival, but if there is an interest generally in this idea of spiritual capital, of going down deeper to a more ethics, values base for the way in which we run society, then I suspect that challenges not only the institutional faith groups to do something to try and engage with that, but it also challenges the way we do politics. Thank you.